Chapter 3. So you've been there 3 weeks, Neville said, licking foam out of his moustache with the tip of his tongue. And you still don't know what it is they actually do? That's right, Paul admitted. And all you do all day long is sort meaningless computer printouts into piles by date order. Yes. For which they pay you. Paul nodded. Bizarre. Neville swilled the last quarter-inch of beer around in the bottom of his glass. You can see for yourself how bizarre it is, can't you? Paul shrugged. I don't know, do I? He said mournfully. I've never had a job before. For all I know, everywhere's the same, and that explains why the world's as fucked up as it obviously is. Neville shook his head and fished in the bottom of the crisp packet for the last residual crumbs. Take it from me, he said. All jobs aren't like that, and your place is definitely weird. Weirder, he added poetically, than 15 white mice in a blender. Trust me on this. Paul thought about it. True, Neville had far more experience of these matters than he did. For one thing, he was a whole year older and had been supporting himself by the sweat of his brow for a whole 6 months, during which time he'd been a trainee stockbroker, a trainee estate agent, a petrol pump attendant, a burger flipper in a busy central London McDonald's, and a self-employed software consultant. Compared with himself, Neville had seen the world. He'd been to Amsterdam on a school trip, twice to Spain, and once to the Greek islands with his family. And when he was 17, he'd spent a whole week once lifting potatoes in the Channel Islands. He'd endured remarkable adventures, eaten strange foods under foreign skies, and enjoyed many opportunities to study the myriad ways of humanity. Also, he had his own car and a girlfriend. On the other hand, the fact that he'd been fired from the 4 jobs where firing was possible implied that he hadn't quite perfected the art of working for other people, and maybe wasn't quite the authority on paid employment that he made himself out to be. I don't know, Paul said. Apart from their partners, they're pretty weird. The rest of them seem quite normal. He thought about Julie and Christine and the fact that there seemed to be a different receptionist on duty every day. Fairly normal, he amended. And just because the work's boring and pointless? Neville shook his head. You're missing the point, he said. They're paying you. Not a lot, true, but they're paying you. 2 of you mind to sit there all day sorting these spreadsheets into date order. Right? Paul nodded. Fine. It hadn't occurred to you then that if only they got themselves a bit more organised and got into the habit of filing these things neatly away as soon as they'd done whatever it is they do with them, they could get rid of you and this peculiar girl of yours and save themselves a bob or two. To his credit, Paul had given the matter some thought, several times over the last 3 weeks. There's probably more to it than that, he said. I mean, the partners are weird, but don't think they're stupid. I expect there's a perfectly good reason behind it all. They just haven't bothered telling me about it, which is fair enough. I mean, so long as I do what I'm told, why should I need to know? True, Neville stood up. I'm going for a pee, he announced, and lumbered away across the bar. While he was gone, Paul reflected on something Neville had said earlier. If it's such a load of crap, he'd said, why'd you stick it? Why don't you pack it in and do something else? Of course, Paul hadn't been able to tell the real reason, because if he'd shyly confessed that there was this girl, actually the strange, rather hostile, well, actually extremely unpleasant girl he shared an office with, Neville would immediately have quizzed him about the steps he'd taken to further the matter, and would have been profoundly unimpressed to hear that he hadn't actually done anything about it at all. Actually, since Neville wasn't first cousin to 2 oak floorboards, he'd probably figured out the part of it for himself. You know what I think, Neville said, reappearing with 2 full pint glasses and wiggling himself comfortably into his seat. I think you've got it up the nose about this weird-sounding bird you're working with, otherwise you'd have told them to stuff it a fortnight ago. What makes you think that? Paul asked. Get real. You obviously hate it there. They're all either nutty as a Snickers bar or complete bastards. The work's boring enough to kill an accountant, and the place is freaking you out so badly you'd jump like petrol prices every time the door opens. Any possible reason you're still there is that you've got yourself hung up on some bird, And, he went on, ignoring Paul's mumbled denials, since I've known you for a decade and observed you closely throughout your troubled formative years, there's money in the bank that you'll have plumped for the one girl in the whole dump that nobody with the brains of a carrot would look twice at, from a mile away, through a busted telescope. Well? Paul felt like the least obvious suspect after Poirot's big speech in the library. Well, all right then, yes, he said irritably. At least I do quite like her, a bit. He slurped a mouthful of beer and decided there wasn't anything to be gained from lying to his oldest friend. Actually, he said, I don't like her at all. She's rude and offhand and does nothing but put me down all the time, but Neville dipped his head gravely. Danny Corbett syndrome, he diagnosed. You remember Danny Corbett? He went on, as Paul raised a dubious eyebrow. Little fat kid with red hair and freckles. Nearly got slung out in fourth year for filling Werewolf Dave's coat pockets with aerosol cream during a maths test. Oh, him, Paul conceded. What's he got to do with it? Well, Neville said, dabbing his moustache on his cuff. I don't know if you remember Fiona Machete, big girl, went on to be a mechanic in the Royal Engineers. Quite. Once seen, never forgotten, though I gather these days she's reckoned to be the fastest mole wrench east of Aldershot. Anyway, Danny and Fiona went out for a while, and to hear either of them talk, the other one was the most disgusting, revolting specimen of humanity who ever evolved from a red-arsed monkey. Fiona reckoned Danny reminded her of a slug that's been left out in the rain and had gone rusty. Danny was always wondering why the hell he bothered with a girl who could eat 2 cream donuts simultaneously and still not stop talking. He sighed. They got married in June, he said, and they're expecting their first kid in April. Oh, Paul said. I see what you mean, I guess. Still, that's neither here nor there. All the more reason for me to clear out of there, if I was being sensible. Neville lit a cigarette. It's up to you, he said. Far as I can tell, victims of Danny Corbett syndrome tend to make out all right in the long run. My guess is, if the other party annoys the hell out of you from day one, makes for a smooth, well-balanced relationship, because that way you sort of fast forward through the dopey sunshines out of his or her backside phase and get to the mutually assured irritation stage that seems to be the default setting for all long-term human couplings. Well, without any of the disillusionment and disappointment that everybody else gets to go through first. I mean, if you know the significant other is a monumental pain in the bum right from the starter's gun, you've spared all the pain of finding it out once you've been together for 2 years and spent good money on kitchen units and curtains. Paul nodded. Talking of which, he said, where is Melanie this evening? Friday's her karate class, Neville replied. She's doing pretty well, apparently. She was telling me the other day she's learned 46 different places on the human body where an accurately placed drop kick will cause instant death. You must be very proud. Neville inclined his head in agreement. Last month it was A-level Spanish, he said. But anyway, to get back to what we were talking about, if you really want to go for it with this miserable-sounding wench of yours, then crack on and stop mucking about. Most likely she'll tell you to fuck off and die, in which case you can jack in the horrible job, get a nice one instead. Failing which, you'll still have the horrible job, but you'll be ahead of the game by one sweetheart. Either way, you're laughing. Paul thought about that. So, that's what you think I ought to do? Absolutely. That's my considered advice to you. No win, no fee. Declaring your true feelings is like going to the dentist. It's no fun at all, but the longer you put it off, the worse it's likely to be. And since in your case there's a definite, highly desirable consolation prize waiting for you when she says no way, not even if it'd mean world peace and the cancellation of third world debt, I can't see any reason why you shouldn't do it first thing in the morning. Oh, tomorrow's Saturday, Paul pointed out. All right, first thing Monday. That way, you've got the whole weekend to get your head together for the ordeal ahead. You know, choose the right words, think tactics, that sort of thing. Oh, look, the pool table's free, Paul said. Next day, since it was a Saturday, Paul stayed in bed till 12 o'clock and spent the afternoon ironing his work shirts for the coming week. The more he thought about Neville's advice, the more undecided he became. On the one hand, there was a chance, statistically speaking, somewhere between a white Christmas in Queensland and winning the lottery without having first bought a ticket, that the thin girl would nod her head and say, "All right then," or words to that effect. That prospect, though terrifying enough in itself, was not without its attractions. On the other, rather more likely hand, he could imagine all too vividly the bone-crushing embarrassment of the 30 seconds or so immediately following his prepared statement, and it was all very well for Neville to talk blithely about chucking in this job and getting a nice one instead, but it had taken him a very long time to find anybody who was prepared to trade in money for a part of his lifespan. The only people who'd proved willing to make such a deal were, by any criteria, as crazy as a barrelful of ferrets. While he'd been unemployed and actively seeking employment, Paul's parents had, albeit grudgingly, stumped up for his rent and the occasional loaf and a tin of baked beans. Somehow, he didn't feel their charity would stand the announcement that he'd quit a paying job simply because he didn't like it very much. That being the case, he'd be faced with sharing a desk indefinitely with a girl he'd just sworn undying love for and who'd unequivocally told him to go stick his head up a chicken. There was one way, in other words, of making his current situation worse than it already was. This surely had to be it. Having finished off the last shirt, Paul folded the board away and, since he didn't have anything else to do, switched on the television. Aggravatingly, there was nothing on any of the channels except sport and a boring old opera musical thing, Gilbert and Sullivan or something like that. A middle-aged man in a black frock coat was cavorting around a plywood set holding a teapot, while a fat woman in a wedding dress and a chubby man in military uniform stared at him, accompanied by an unseen orchestra. He put the television out of its misery with a deft prod of his index finger, plumped on the bed and reached for his library book, which he'd taken out on his way home on Thursday and hadn't got round to reading yet. Further aggravation. Instead of the book he thought he'd checked out, the enticingly titled A History of Modern Railways, Volume 2, 1927-60, he'd somehow been landed with something entirely different. The Savoy Operas by Gilbert and Sullivan. Scowling, he opened the book at random, song lyrics and dialogue. He didn't throw the book at the opposite wall, partly because it was a library book and partly because, knowing his aim, he'd miss the wall and break the window. But he dumped it on the floor with considerable force. And then he picked it up again and squinted at the spine. Odd, he thought. Well, he thought, if someone's trying to tell me something, I'm buggered if I know what it is. He opened the book again, but there didn't appear to be anything significant or sinister about it. A flute-playing vicar was singing a song about how girls used to fancy him when he was younger. Lucky old him, Paul thought wistfully, and he put the book back on the floor. Even so, he felt unsettled, as though there was a whole gallery of people watching him, and giggling discreetly. He stood up, looked at his watch, and grabbed his coat. In the pocket there was a £5 note, a £2 coin, and some silver. That was basically all he had to last him through to the end of the week, when hopefully J.W.Wells and Co. would do the decent thing and deposit money in his bank account. Nevertheless, he needed cheering up, and also to get out of this crummy little bedsit for a while. Time to throw caution to the winds. For his evening meal, he'd been planning on using up the crust of the loaf and the last of the mousetrap cheese. But the hell with that. Life is for living, and you're a long time dead. He resolved to stroll down to the shop on the corner and buy himself a frozen pizza. It was cold out, just starting to get dark. He crossed the road only to find that the shop was shut. He hadn't expected that. All the time he'd been living there, he'd only once seen the close notice in Mr. Singh's window, and that had been at 3 a.m. last Christmas Day. He debated with himself as to what to do next. He could go home, save his money, and see how much viable cheese he could excavate from under the soft carpet of green mould, or he could hike across to Tesco and buy his pizza there. On one dilemma horn, a sharp west wind and a few warning drops of rain. On the other, his miserable home and the lurking, subliminal presence of Gilbert and Sullivan. He decided to go to Tesco. For once, it wasn't too crowded. In fact, it was practically deserted. He took his time at the freezer gondola, unable to make up his mind between a thin crust quattro stagioni and a deep pan pepperoni feast. After several minutes of dithering, he resolved to use the force, put both of them back, closed his eyes and grabbed. Apparently the force wanted him to have the pepperoni, so that was all right. He turned towards a row of checkout desks and nearly collided with Mr. Tanner. "Garg, garg," he thought, but he kept the sentiment locked in his heart and skipped out of the way like a trained fencer. For one blissful moment he thought Mr. Tanner hadn't recognised him. After all, why should he? They'd only met once face to face, not counting the interview, and though the occasion was etched on Paul's memory like a septic scar, there was no reason why Mr. Tanner should remember him particularly. Paul had long since got used to the fact that he was the most forgettable person in the world since what's-his-name. But then Mr. Tanner's head swivelled round, and Paul saw his face slide into his trademark unpleasant grin. "Bloody hell," said Mr. Tanner. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Tanner was holding a wire basket in his small, claw-like hand, and in the basket were a bottle of bleach, some dishwasher tablets, 2 J-cloths, 3 packets of Flora, a 6-pack of peach toilet rolls, and a medium-sized melon. In his other hand he held a shopping list, with half of the entries crossed off in red ink. Somehow, the fact that Mr. Tanner's wife had sent him out to buy J-cloths and bog rolls on a cold Saturday afternoon made him somewhat less menacing, if not actually human. Then at least vaguely humanoid. Actually, Paul said, I live just round the corner. Ah, do you? Mr. Tanner frowned. Yes, you're right, you do. I remember it from your application form. Chicago-style pepperoni feast, he went on, peering at the box in Paul's hand. Obviously, we're paying you too much. We're having rissoles, he added, with just a hint of pathos. Just for an instant, Paul felt a mad impulse to invite Mr. Tanner to share his pizza, with cheese on toast to follow. Luckily, the fit passed as quickly as it had come, but it left Paul with no idea as to what to say next. He could feel his toes curling inside his shoes. Well, Mr. Tanner said, after a very long 2 seconds or so, I'd better get on, or I'll get spoken to. Enjoy your pizza. Thank you, Paul said, and backed away towards the checkout. Infuriatingly, a queue had materialised at the only open desk. Paul stood in line, the chill from the frozen pizza slowly numbing his fingertips, and cursed under his breath. It'd be just his luck if before he worked his way to the front of the line, Mr. Tanner finished his shopping and came and stood behind him, which would entail further and worse embarrassment. For 2 pins he'd have dumped the pizza on the floor and bolted like a rabbit out of the store, except that he knew that if he did that, he'd run into Mr. Tanner again on the way out, and Mr. Tanner would stare at him, breathless and pizzaless, and he'd probably die where he stood. Then a large woman came and stood behind him with a fully loaded trolley, and he knew, for the moment at least, he was safe. When his turn finally came, he paid for the pizza, fumbled it into a plastic bag, one of the type that you can't get open unless you happen to have honey smeared all over your fingertips, took his change and made a dash for the door. Through it and safe, except that Mr. Tanner was outside. Ow! Standing on the pavement with his own plastic carrier in his hand and looking up the street in the opposite direction. By now, Paul was as freaked out as it was possible to be with that external chemical influence. Above all, he didn't want to have anything more to do with his employer until Monday morning at the earliest. Preferably not ever again. Not if he was drowning in the North Atlantic, and Mr. Tanner appeared to float by in a rubber dinghy holding a lifebelt. Just then, a bus pulled up at the stop opposite the door. It seemed like the obvious answer, or at least a good idea at the time. He jumped on the bus and it pulled away. This is all right, Paul told himself, catching his breath and balance as the bus gathered speed. All I've got to do is hop off at the next stop and walk home. No big deal. If I'm lucky, be off again before the conductor comes round and I won't even have to pay. Where to? Said a voice behind him. Oh well, he thought. Just the next stop, please, he sighed. Next stop, Highgate Village. What? Next up, Highgate Village. That wasn't right. You mean it's going all that way before it stops? Yep. But that's a quarter of an hour ride. I just want to get off around here somewhere. He looked over the conductor's shoulder. There was nobody else on the bus. Next up, Highgate Village, the conductor said, and demanded money. It was, Paul decided, all the fault of that goddamn pizza, because, after he'd paid for that and his fare, he was left with 12 pence and the prospect of a long walk home in the rain. He nosed around for a bright side to look on, but the best he could come up with was the certainty that the pizza would have defrosted completely by the time he got back. It was something, but not enough to make up for the rain or the distance or the unpleasant discovery that there was a hole in his left shoe. All in all, he told himself, as he set out on the long march, I'd have been better off at home in front of the telly. That reflection reminded him of something he'd been trying not to think about. And at that precise moment he caught sight of a little pink flyer taped to the inside of a shop window. Highgate Amateur Operatic Society presents The Sorcerer by W.S. Gilbert and Sir Arthur Sullivan. Highgate Community Arts Centre, Saturday 17th December, 6:30 p.m, admission £5. In other words, he realised, glancing at his watch, right now. And he looked down the road, just over there, in that grey concrete building that looks like an abattoir. Paul thought about it for a moment. Fuck off, he thought. And then he grinned, because thanks to the frozen pizza and the bus ride, he didn't have any money for a ticket anyway. Didn't think of that, did you? He taunted the darkened heavens, as something fluttered out of the window of a passing Mercedes and settled placidly at his feet. It was, of course, a £5 note. That shook him, down to his soggy socks. He could feel a pair of virtual crosshairs closing in on his forehead, as chilling as the defrosted pizza juice trickling down the gap between his collar and his skin. There didn't seem to be any point in fighting it any more. No matter what he tried to do next, whether he ran or hid, the long spectral arm of Gilbert and Sullivan was bound to attach itself to his ear and reel him back, like a fish, exhausted by its battle against the angler. But he still had a tiny scrap of courage left, smeared under the rim of his soul. No, he thought, I am not a light opera buff. I am a free man. I shall not go gently into the Highgate Community Arts Centre. In fact, I will cross the road and... The van missed him by inches. He jumped back into the curb, trembling, and clutched a lamp-post to keep himself upright. On the other hand, he thought, it's not like I'm doing anything this evening, and this Gilbert and Sullivan crap is supposed to be really good. At least, he remembered, his Aunt Patricia was dead keen on it, though that wasn't the kind of endorsement he usually put much stock in. If that's what it takes to get me out of here in one piece, then why not? The worst that can happen is I'll wake up in the interval with a cricked neck. So, like a schoolboy unwillingly to school, he walked slowly towards the concrete facade. There were loads of pink flyers pinned to the notice board outside, and the door was open. He wasn't quite sure what he was going to do with the frozen pizza, but he felt curiously unwilling to relinquish it, even though it was arguably the root cause of all his misfortunes. And then, he thought, where in the Bible does it say, don't go buying pizzas you can't afford, or Gilbert and Sullivan will come and get you? He stuffed it under his coat and advanced into the stream of yellow light leaking through the doorway. And then someone walked towards him, and by that yellow glow he could see who it was. She saw him in a fraction of a second later and quickened her step, trying to get past him before he noticed her, but it was too late for that. "Hello?" Paul said. "Hello," the thin girl replied. "What are you doing here?" Truth is a luxury, rather like a pepperoni pizza. Those who can afford it insist on nothing else, while the rest of us just have to make do. I was visiting my second cousin," he said. But he's out." "Oh," she looked at him. "Why are you carrying a soggy cardboard box?" she asked. It's pizza," he replied. "I brought it along for my cousin." The lights of a passing car raked her face, and to his amazement he saw that she'd been crying. The puffy red eyes, the tear spur, distinctive as the silver slime trail of a slug. "How about you?" he asked. "Me?" she said, as if she couldn't think of a more bizarre subject to conversation. "Oh, I was just She stopped, and for the first time looked at him as if he wasn't the back end of a maggot she just noticed in a half-eaten apple. A tiny voice in the back of Paul's mind assured him that he was going to regret this, but he refused to listen. "Nothing," she said. 10 doors down lay a pub, and Paul remembered he had a £5 note in his shirt pocket. "Come and have a drink," he said. "No thanks," she should have said. Instead she said, "What about your pizza?" "What?" "If it defrosts it'll go all soggy." "Actually," Paul said, "I'm not hungry." He stooped down and propped the box carefully against the wall of the Highgate Community Arts Centre, like a druid making an offering of mistletoe. "Come on," he said. And amazingly, she muttered, "All right," and nodded. The pub was horribly full. They had to turn side on to get through the crush around the door, and the bar was lost to sight behind the press of flesh. From somewhere out back came the unique collage of strange noises that only a British pub jazz band can make. Paul snarled helplessly. This wasn't at all what he had in mind. And then, to his great surprise, he saw an empty table, tucked away in a corner next to the toilet door. He nodded at it, and the thin girl nodded back, and headed for it. Fine, Paul thought, and started threading his way through to the bar. All the time he was waiting to get served, and all the weary way back, clutching a pint of Guinness in a straight glass and a small Britvic orange, he was sure she'd be gone by the time he'd reached the far-flung table. When the shoulders and elbows parted, and he saw her still there, picking at her nose with a scrap of shredded Kleenex, he could have shouted for joy. He slid into his seat, put down the Guinness in front of her, and said, "That's right, isn't it?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It's what you had in that pub after the interview," he explained. "Oh," she said. "Well, cheers," he suggested. He sipped a tiny drop of orange juice, while she nibbled at the froth of a beer. The jazz band made a noise like a circular saw cutting an aluminium sheet. A fat man pushed past on his way to the gents. Once again, Paul had a strong feeling that he was being closely observed by an invisible peanut gallery who were going to start slow hand-clapping unless he got the show on the road. But what show, and what road? The unseen watchers presumably knew, but he didn't. "Fancy bumping into each other like this," he said. The invisible audience didn't think much of that. Neither did the thin girl, and neither did he. He tried again. "Is this your neck of the woods, then?" he asked. "No," she answered, and she'd have been perfectly within her rights to leave it at that. It was a feckless piece of cross-examination, and even the lowliest junior barrister would have laughed in his face. But, quite unexpectedly, she went on, "Actually, I live in Wimbledon. I came to see my boyfriend in a play." The world tightened around Paul's head like a drill chuck. "Oh," he said. She looked at him and grinned sadly. "If you must know," she said, "we've just broken up." "Oh," said Paul. "I'm sorry," he lied through his teeth. "That's why I've been crying." Right." She sighed and looked past him, as if he wasn't there. "I came all this way just to see him in this stupid musical, because he kept on and on at me about it. And then when I got here, I thought, what's the point? And so—" "Just a moment," Paul interrupted. "By musical, do you mean Gilbert and Sullivan?" She gave him a look you could have skewered kebabs on. "All right, not musical, operetta. Do you like that stuff?" "No." She nodded very slightly, as if forced to concede he'd given the right answer. "So I went round backstage and told him," she said. "I said, there's just no point in us going on any more, is there? And he said he didn't know what I meant. I said, well, exactly, and that's why it's pretty pointless, us just dragging along any longer, because we're both just lying to ourselves. There just wasn't any—" "Point?" She nodded. "And then I gave him back the CD he gave me last Christmas, and the pen he'd lent me 4 months ago, when we went to the Earl's Court bike show, and I walked out." "I see," Paul said. "So he's pretty keen on Gilbert and Sullivan, this bloke?" She scowled at him and then shrugged. "He never used to be," she said. "All he ever used to care about was motorbikes and animal rights and the fight against global warming. Then quite suddenly, about a month ago, he seemed to go all strange, like he started wearing straw hats and blazers and stupid embroidered waistcoats. And he told me he'd joined this amateur operatic thing, and he was going to be the star in this stupid opera they were doing. It was like he turned into somebody else, just like that, without any warning." Paul thought for a moment, though at something of a tangent to what she'd just said. Rather than tell her what was on his mind, however, he said, "Sounds to me like he's met someone else." She sighed. "That's what I thought," she said. "Only I don't think so. Like, he was always dead keen for me to go and see him at rehearsals, or listen to him saying his stupid lines. Told him to get stuffed, of course, but he went on asking, so I don't think he's got another girl or anything." She frowned. "And when I told him we were finished, he looked really surprised, like it was a total shock. If he'd found someone else, he should have been happy for me to break it off, wouldn't you say?" "I guess so," Paul replied. And then it struck him, as though he was Sir Isaac Newton and he'd just been hit on the head by a huge, scrummy toffee apple. Yes, until fairly recently she'd had a boyfriend, but the boyfriend was just down the road in the Highgate Community Arts Centre, warbling away like a demented nightingale, while he was in this pub, with her. Furthermore, there was the timing of the thing to be considered. In her darkest hour, when what she most desperately needed was someone to talk to, destiny had chivied him up here from Kentish Town and put him in exactly the right place at precisely the right time. Suddenly, it all made sense, apart from the rather bewildering fact that Destiny had felt obliged to disguise herself as two dead purveyors of 19th century popular culture. And if that was what lit Destiny's candle for her, he wasn't about to criticise. Each to his own, he reckoned, and it could have been a whole lot worse. "I'm really sorry," he said, with all the sincerity he could muster. "You must be feeling awful." She shrugged. "A bit," she said. "I mean, yes, I did like him, quite a lot at one point, but I always got the feeling that when we were together I wasn't really being me, if you follow me. I mean, I wasn't being the me I wanted to be. I was being the me he wanted me to be, or at least the me he thought I wanted to be. And I was trying to want to be the me he thought I wanted to be, for his sake. And neither of us was being ourselves, so we could never really be us, in a together sort of way. And so it was all really pretty pointless, for me and for him. Do you see what I mean?" Yes," Paul lied. It must have been pretty miserable for you." "And for him, I suppose." "I guess, actually," he admitted, though he couldn't for the life of him think why, "I've never broken up with anybody, so I wouldn't really know." "Oh," she said. "You're in a long-term relationship, then?" "No." She considered that as if it was a complex piece of mental arithmetic. "You've never had a girlfriend, then?" "No." "Oh." "Not," he added, "for want of trying, but everyone I ever liked told me to get lost." She looked at him over the rim of her glass. She had a formed moustache which quite suited her. "Really?" He shrugged. "Not that it matters," he said. "I'm just saying it's better to have loved and lost and all that stuff." "No, it isn't." "Isn't it? Well, I expect you're right." "Anyway, what I'm trying to say is, I don't really know how bad you're feeling, but I expect it's pretty bad, though I don't suppose you want sympathy either, so I'll just shut up now. That's about it, really." "Thanks," she said. "Though it's probably just as well. I'm not a nice person, I'm afraid." "Oh, for crying out loud," Paul thought. "You're nicer than Mr. Tanner," he said. "I bumped into him this afternoon, in Tesco's." She opened her eyes wide. "In Tesco's?" "Just what I thought," he replied. "Though really, I don't see why it should seem so odd. I mean, even unmitigated bastards have to shop occasionally." She frowned. "I'd have thought he'd made his wife do all the shopping," she said. "Me too, but apparently not. He had a little list, and he was crossing things off as he went along." She very nearly smiled. "Did he see you?" Paul nodded. "I walked straight into him, and he was on to me before I could get away. Like you and me just now," he didn't add. "He laughed at my pizza," he said. "Bastard." "I thought so." She wrinkled her top lip into a sneer. "I expect his wife does Delia Smith recipes," she said, "or fancy ready meals from Marks and Spencer's." "Actually, they're having rissoles," he told me. "Rissoles?" Paul nodded. "It only goes to show there is some justice in the world after all. You go around being a right bastard for 40-odd years, and sooner or later you're going to get rissoles. Serves him right, I reckon." That little crackle of fire from fingertip to fingertip. Actually, nothing as energetic as fire, nothing so showy or conspicuous, but a little warmth on a cold, wet night. No nightingales in Berkeley Square, just the muffled roar of the jazz band, half of whom appeared to be playing Darktown Strutter's Ball, while the rival faction were blasting out Hello Central Give Me Dr. Jazz, with every fibre of their being. They were fighting a losing battle, and they probably knew it, but nobody could accuse them of being quitters. Meanwhile, the pub jukebox was pumping out the current number one in a happy cybernetic oblivion. It was odd that such a rowdy, untidy moment could be so perfect. But it was, because this time she did smile, though it was only a flicker, brief and unusual as a shooting star. "I'd better go," she said. "Oh," Paul thought, and the perfect moment evaporated like a blowtorch snow. "Well," he said, "nice bumping into you, and I'm really sorry about—" She shrugged. "Actually," she said, "it's not so bad." Hesitation. Paul could almost see the roulette wheel going round with a little white ball skittering about on it. "See you Monday, then," she said, and in the back bar, bang on time and clear as a bell, the jazz band launched into When the Saints Go Marching In. It wasn't what she'd said, it was the way she'd said it. "Right," he replied, in a voice quiet with awe. "See you Monday." At the door of the pub, he turned right and she turned left. The rain was cold and hard, and he no longer had enough for the bus fare, but that didn't matter, and neither did the hole in his shoe. Stupid, he thought, because he hadn't established anything, hadn't come away with a signed contract or something he could take to the bank. A slight thaw, maybe, an IOU for a few friendly words or a smile, redeemable at an unspecified future date, written on rice paper in invisible ink. Some people, most people for all he knew, did this sort of thing every day. Made friends, established goodwill, maybe planted the seed of affection without even trying or knowing they were doing it. Some people, most people, but not him, he thought. In this regard, he'd always been the threadbare Russian peasant, watching the fine gentlemen go by in their gilded carriages, knowing that whatever he might get his hands on in this life, it wouldn't be that. But now, who knew? Something very odd was going on, but he didn't mind a bit. From Highgate village to Kentish town was hardly far enough for savouring such thoughts as these, even with the rain in his eyes and a soggy left sock. Somewhere in the great darkness of London, Mr. Tanner was slowly eating his rissoles. The ex-boyfriend was capering and warbling his hour upon the stage, and if his heart was broken, well, it had to be someone else's turn sooner or later. And the thin girl was back home, toweling off her wet hair and either explaining or refusing to explain why she was back so early from the theatre. As he fumbled in his pocket for the front door key, Paul could almost see them, each in a separate window on his mental desktop. Never before had he felt such a strong sense of so many things going on at once all around him. From sunrise in Tasmania to sunset in Tashkent, and the strangest notion that somehow he was in the middle of it all, that everything led to him the way that all roads converge on London. Which was crazy. Just because a man's hounded across the city by Gilbert and Sullivan right into the arms of the girl of his dreams, it doesn't necessarily follow that he's important. Maybe everybody in the world's allowed 1/2 hour of supernatural intervention, one statutory wish from a national health genie to give them their shot at happiness, and the only thing that was at all special about him was that he was one of the 1% who actually noticed. Or something like that. He closed the front door behind him and squelched up the stairs. Cheese on toast, he thought, and a cup of black tea. Ah, well. As Paul stepped out onto the landing, he saw that the door of his bedsit was open. That wasn't wonderfully good, because as it happened he could distinctly remember the click of the bolt as he'd closed it behind him when he'd left earlier. Not that he had anything at all worth stealing, unless a mad collector of 1980s electronics wanted exactly his model of radio cassette player to complete his collection, or the Victoria and Albert Museum had heard about his black and white portable and sent a snatch squad. Even so... He pushed the door with his toe and it swung in. The light was on, and he remembered turning it off. He counted to 10, added 2 for luck, and went in. It wasn't the god-awful mess that caught his eye, because Paul wasn't the tidiest person who ever saved a milk bottle top, and it'd have taken some time and thought to differentiate between the havoc wrought by the intruder and his normal habitat. It wasn't the absence of key possessions, though on subsequent inspection he discovered that his tin opener had gone, and also his ironing board cover, 3 odd socks, and his library book. What he noticed at once as he walked in, and couldn't have helped noticing unless he'd been blind, was the very large block of stone resting halfway between the wash basin and the bed, and the very large, shiny, double-handed sword that was stuck in it.